You are listening to the Intrepid Radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, happy Friday, ladies and gentlemen. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid Radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com to hear all the audio sources. And you can come over and join the live stream simulcast in video over on my YouTube channel. And that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And join all the other Intrepheads as we talk and chat in live interactive format over on the YouTube channel. So come and join us. Thanks for being here. We're going to pick up with our series where we left off, and we're going to talk more about all this historical stuff with Christianity. But before I do, I want to mention, how many middle-aged, post-middle-aged guys are out there that listen to the show? And you realize every day you look in the mirror and your hair just isn't what it used to be. That's what I'm facing. This isn't a commercial. This is just me belly aching about the fact that, growing older doesn't really bother me all that much until you start factoring in all the little quirks and all the things that don't work the same anymore. The fact that your hair goes away. I don't know, what is it about old age? Is that just the decay of the human body that takes away your hair? And there's nothing you can do to make it look good anymore. I think this is why some guys just shave their heads. I'm about ready to do that because those of you on the radio, you can't see me, but from one angle in a photograph, my hair looks pretty good. You get around the sides, you look at the top, and you can see, whoa, he's got not much growing there anymore. The farmland has been cultivated and the harvest was in a long time ago, and the field is growing fallow. So, having said all that, I notice that because we do a video broadcast here that simulcasts with the radio show, and you got to look your best because you're on radio. I don't want to come on, with my hair sticking up all over for what's left up there. There's some days I think I'm going to end up in a few years looking like Gollum from the Lord of the Rings movies, all bald with just a few really long strands of thick hair that are left on there. So, anyway, that's my complaint and rant for this morning. If any of you have an answer to that, wouldn't it be nice, guys that are going bald? There's even women, they're a little older than me usually, that their hair starts thinning. And it's like, what do you do about that? Do you have to go to Hair Club for Men? No, I don't want that. I don't want fake hair. I want my real hair to grow back. I wonder if this whole stem cell stuff, umbilical stem cell stuff that Rocky Stucci works with, I wonder if that can regrow hair follicles. Wouldn't that be nice? I'd love to have a big, full, thick of hair, mane of hair. But there it is. I don't anymore. And, of course, it's whiter than it's ever been. But that's my age, I'm pushing 60. So there you go. But, it's not an age thing. I'm not complaining about aging. It's like I said at the beginning, age is a state of mind, they say. No, age is a state of physical body. Your body's deteriorating. Your mind may be young, and maybe the way you act could be younger. I still have elements of me that feels like I'm, 20 years old. But there are other elements where I've learned a few things. You gain a little bit of gray wisdom, white wisdom. You grow up, you mature, but you still want to do that fun stuff. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the physical ramifications of aging. And that is because you can be as 19 years old in your head as you want to be, but you go out and party or play football the way you did when you were 19, you know what? At age 59, you're going to be laid up for a while. So it just doesn't work the same anymore. So, there's my bellyache for the day. If you've got some good magic for me, is there a magic spell? Travis Thorpe, are you out there? Some good magic I can do for my hair? Or is that all the only magic is, apply Rogaine or whatever it is anymore. I don't even know what it is. So I don't do that stuff. Maybe I should. Maybe I should have lotioned better when I was younger. That's what somebody told me about my aging skin. Oh, you should have used more lotion when you were younger. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't think about lotion when I was younger. Back in my day when I was in my prime, my late 20s to my late 30s, that age where, you feel you're in your prime, you're in your best shape. And you think, lotion, that's so metrosexual, I'm not doing that. That was the big thing back in the 80s and the 90s for me. But then I met my beautiful wife when I was 44 years old. And so I was still at 44, feeling like I looked awfully chap, you know what I mean? And I was in good shape. I had all my hair. And I even had the guy that cut my hair said, "You're never going to lose your hair. Look at that thick mane of hair." And, of course, it went away a few years after that. I'm onto it now. Maybe it's linked with domestication. That might have something to do with it. I love my wife. But being domesticated, is that why I've grown lax in my working out? Is that why your body starts to fall apart? I don't know. I'm just being lighthearted. I have to say that because I got nobody to play off here. I'm playing off of you guys. Hey, is this thing on? These are the jokes, folks. These are the jokes. All right, let's get into talking about Christianity. I think this is an important topic. I think it's important to know these things. And so we're going to dig back into this today and talk about some aspects you might not know. Now, I'm going to reference again the Q material, capital Q, the Q material. Or Q source if you want to. And I'm figuring, I explained this a little bit at one point early on in some of these discussions we're having. But at the same time, I'm thinking that maybe not everybody caught what that is. And I keep mentioning it. Some of you over in the chat room, over on my YouTube channel, have said, "Oh, I love the Q source." I can't remember who said that. I don't know if it was Melinda or somebody else over there. That seems to ring a bell. But let's look at, I want to talk about what the Q source is for a minute. When I was in biblical studies in Bible college, more in seminary, what we did was we would go back to the quote-unquote original manuscripts. Well, as original as we could get. Because we don't have anything that goes all the way back to the 1st century, the 2nd century. We've got collections of things that we know are copies of originals. So the big textual criticisms courses we always took was, how can you tell what is original? How can you tell what was there? And if you've been listening to this series, you'll remember we run across a lot of things that books have been destroyed. The Orthodox Church destroyed all the books that had the ancient mystery writings, because it conflicted with what the orthodoxy of the church wanted to teach. And it conflicted with the hierarchy in the church. And so there is a source called the Q source that we go back to. And it's not really a written source, so it's a little hard to understand. Let me tell you what that is. The Q source, it's called the Q document or the Q gospel, Q material. It's from the German word quelle, and I think I'm pronouncing that right. That's how it's spelled, Quelle, quelle. And that just simply means source. So the Q source, the source, if you will. It's a hypothetical written collection of the primary Jesus sayings. Nobody knows that this ever really existed, but they're assuming it is by many different factors. And Q is part of the common material that's found in the Gospels of Matthew and the Gospels of Luke. But you don't find it in the Gospel of Mark. So there's at least 2 of the Gospels of what was considered the accepted, canonical, God-breathed scriptural Gospels of the 4 that are in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Out of the 70-some that were written, they excluded all the others and said these are the only 4 that work. Well, it's because I think there was a lot of political... How would I state that? There was a lot of information in them that supported the political hierarchy, the political methodology of the Orthodox Church. And so the Orthodox Church was the one who created that canon of Scripture that we see in the New Testament now. And at the same time, they eliminated, they burned, they banned, they got rid of all the other material because it conflicted with what they believed was the only thing God wanted you to know. Thank you very much. So this Q material, it's found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke that seem to have corresponding information. And could that be that it was just two guys who were there and saw it? No, Luke wasn't there when some of this stuff happened. He came on the scene later. And he worked with Paul an awful lot. He also wrote the book of Acts after the Gospels. But now, so Matthew and Luke, but not the Gospel of Mark. And John right out. So along with the Markian priority, they call it, the Mark's Gospel, they're saying that according to this hypothesis, this material in the Q source was drawn from the early church's oral traditions. And it was hypothesized by 1900, and it's one of the foundations of the most modern gospel scholarship that's out there on the construction of the New Testament. And let's see, I'm looking at all the different names. B.H. Streeter formulated a widely accepted view of Q, that it was written in Koine Greek. Now, Koine Greek is what you will find the bulk of the New Testament is written in. If you've ever been to a Baptist church or something, let's go to our Bibles and let's see what the original Koine Greek has to say about this verse. That's because you look at it in Koine Greek. Koine Greek was the language of commerce in first century Judea, or the first century world, in the Roman Empire. Greek was the language of commerce, and it was a universal language that people from all these different regions were able to speak and write if they were engaged in business, engaged in scholarship, literacy, and things like that. And so Koine Greek, they say, was written, and that most of it most of the contents of the Q source appear in Matthew, in Luke, or in both, and that Luke more than often preserves the text's original order than Matthew did. And in the two-source hypothesis, the three-source hypothesis, and the Q plus Papias hypothesis, Matthew and Luke both used Mark and Q as sources. So some scholars have postulated that Q, the Q source, is actually a plurality of sources. Some written, some oral. Others have attempted to define the stages in which Q was composed. So all of this scholarship goes into finding out if, and why is that important to know a source? If we're going to postulate that a certain set of dogmas or theologies or traditions or histories are accurate and worth, at least on the faith level in theology, worth putting your trust and faith into, then there has to be some solid, substantive source point on which to do that. Otherwise, you're putting blind faith on blind nothing. Somebody said to me just this morning on Facebook that faith, it's all about faith. I mentioned something about Noah's Ark. And somebody said, well, that's why we believe all that, and it's by faith, and that's the power of faith. And I said, the power of faith to me is having a solid, factual, evidential foundation. Why would I want to put my faith in something that I don't know is real? Well, that's the beauty and the power of faith in God, I was told. I said, no, it isn't. That's like going like this and walking toward a cliff and hoping I'm not going to walk off the edge. So Q's existence has been questioned, obviously, omitting what should have been a highly treasured Dominical document from all early church catalogs, and its lack of mention by Jerome is a conundrum of modern biblical scholarship. But copying Q might have been seen as unnecessary as it was preserved in the canonical Gospels. So it became preferable to copy the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, where the sayings of Jesus from Q were rephrased to avoid misunderstandings. and to fit their own situations, their own understandings of Jesus and what he really meant into their contexts. And so despite challenges, the two-source hypothesis retains pretty wide support out there. And there's a whole history of the Q source and the composition of the Q source, the synoptic gospels and the nature of the Q source, the case for Q source, the case against it. These are all things that are out there as you study this. So suffice it to say, all I really wanted to do here was to give you an understanding of what I mean when I mention the Q material or the Q source, that it is all that collective of the works of Jesus that is hypothetical. We don't know if it even exists yet. The way we substantiate the hypothesis is to say that materials in at least two of the Gospels are so similar that it's saying they had a common source. And Mark is kind of the same way. Maybe they drew it from Mark, who drew it from the Q source. So that's all we mean. There's an existence out there of a collective. And they say that that collective of Q material dates as early as, it could be as early as the late 30s AD. Now, if Jesus actually lived historically, which I think he did, and I believe he did, I think there's enough evidence of that. If he lived historically, they say he died between 30 and, between like 26 and 33 AD, in that range of time, depending on where you place his birth. They say he was 33 years old. 30 when he started his public ministry, which ran 3 years. Then he was crucified. So some say he wasn't born in 0 between BC and AD. He was born, some say, in 4 BC. Others say as early as 6 or 7 BC. So if he lived to be 33, you can do the math and see when he died. So as early as, and by the way, that birth date, it all has to align with the death of Herod the Great. Because remember in the Jesus stories, it says that the wise men from the east, they stopped in to see Herod the king of Israel, the puppet king. It was really Rome that was ruling. But Herod, as the puppet king, became very jealous of whoever this baby might be that was born king of the Jews. And he wanted to off him. And so, but then Herod dies in 4 BC. So Jesus' birth would have had to have been 4 BC or earlier. They do say by the time the Magi arrived that Jesus might have been around 2 years old. That's why they go back as far as 6 or 7 BC for the birth. So all of this, when you start looking at the history, and the Q material, some of this, they say was composed as early as within 5 to 10 years after the death of Jesus, or composed as he had died and the movement started to grow, that this material became composed. But there's no physical evidence of it, other than to look at physical books we do have and say, well, there's similarities there that obviously drew on a different source. So there you go. Enough on that. There's that, if you will, academic lesson light regarding how we look into documents. And I took textual criticisms courses when I was in seminary. That is, taking some of the problem passages and finding out, digging into them and breaking down into the Koine Greek. Sometimes there was Aramaic present. And you had to break that all down and try to figure out what those texts meant, where they were sourced. We had the Codex A and the Codex B, and documents like that that are documents that exist, but they are, everybody believes, copies because they were later in time that those became available. So you can date most of what you read in the Bible back to a couple of documents academically within 300 years of the time of Jesus. So it's interesting material. And this Q source, we'll mention it again. And the reason I brought this up is because I start out today talking a little bit about what we find in the Q source. So I wanted to recap that for you. That's interesting to me, that you have to find some source material that backs up a claim. All right? Otherwise, you're believing it by blind faith. So faith needs an object. Faith isn't blind. You still have to... I don't want to be told I have to believe something by faith and have no proof that that thing that I'm putting my faith in even exists. So it's good to have a little substance behind your faith. So we've already explored what mainstream scholarship has to say about the formation and the content of the Gospels, the 4 Gospels that we have, and the New Testament as a whole. And this includes efforts to date writings, and as with the Q material, the Q source material, to sift through the layer upon layer of writings in order to understand how the character of Jesus evolved and developed for the Orthodox Church. And this chapter of all of this material lies firmly in the hands of scholars that dig into this stuff. You have to wonder where they got their information, how they formulated this. You have to have a whole body of knowledge to try to substantiate that there was something that it's talking about, that these faith elements had a source. This is, again, where the Q source comes in. And it presents a perspective on the creations of the Gospels. As with all the material that I've presented you here, that's out there in academia, still has to be left to you to determine which sources, weigh the evidence, make your own decision. After all of this boils down to what your spirituality is going to be. The original questions we were asking weeks ago. Why do you believe what you say you believe? What's your spirituality? What do you pass on to your kids? What of your spirituality makes itself evident in your daily life? These are questions. Now you've got that spirituality. What's that based on? Let me ask you that. Should spirituality, your personal spiritual beliefs, many people go, I don't care what anybody thinks about this is what I choose to believe. Well, why do you choose to believe that is the question. I would like to know, and I would like to ask you, why do you believe what you say you believe? What is it that draws you to your conclusions? What if you say, well, I believe in having no conclusions? Well, that's a conclusion all by itself. It's like saying absolutism is the new absolute. I don't believe in absolutes. And you're making an absolute imperative statement when you say that. So the common view of the creation of the Gospels and the New Testament holds that the writings occurred over the course of many years. And Paul's writings may have come first, for all we know. But meanwhile, the Gospels existed in fragmentary form. They were collections of sayings of Jesus, as in the Q source. They're recollections of those who said they knew Jesus or walked with Jesus or was a disciple of Jesus or a follower of Jesus when he was alive. Or they heard stories about him and so on and so on and so on. And so these pieces and these fragments were then gathered up, according to the common view, and were compiled into the 4 Gospels, or written by these 4 different writers. And it was over a period of time in the mid to late 1st century A.D. And perhaps it was a span covering 50 or more years that these 4 books were compiled. It's not like all these guys got together and go, hey, I'm writing a book on the same thing. What did you have to do? Do you remember this story the way I remember it? No. Wait, it was this and this and this. So it's interesting that these 4 Gospels cover a span of time. And these guys weren't all hanging out together somewhere. And so they drew their material, they said, on a common source. At least 2 of them. And some say that Mark was the common source that drew off of the Q material. So it covered a span of years and decades. But what if the Gospels weren't really produced in this fashion? That's a hypothesis. So there's a historian, Charles Waite, who surveyed 26 Christian writers up to the year 170 of the Common Era, of AD, and notes that in none of them is there a single mention of the Gospels. for 170 years, the first 170 years, or roughly 150 years after the time of Jesus. The Gospels are never mentioned. And this seems really strange for a collection of writings that had supposedly, these sayings of Jesus, been circulating in bits and pieces among the Christian community beginning shortly after Jesus' death. And you know what? I noticed I've run really tight on time, so we got to cut out to break. You sit tight for 2 minutes. We'll be right back. Hey gang, welcome back. Thanks for hanging on during the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid Radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you are, if you're not watching the simulcast already on the YouTube channel, you can go over there, catch the simulcast in video, join the other Intrepids in the live chat room, interactive, discuss the show, whatever you want, over on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And folks, go over and check out also streamingtalkradio.com. streamingtalkradio.com. That's the site that Rocky Stucci built for the Rocky Stucci Situation Room and for my show, the Intrepid Radio program, and everything we do and some of the people that we're associated with. If you go over there, scroll down, you'll see the logo for the Situation Room, which is a glass of whiskey with a cigar laying across it. Just scroll down a little bit and both Rockies and my pictures will show up. Click on either one of those, and you can find us anywhere. You can find everything there is to know about us that we wanted to share on there anyway. And as for me, you know, I'm a designer. I'm an illustrator. If you need design work done, illustration work done, and you know what that looks like? It's the kind of stuff I design book covers. Do a lot of that for people. I have a lot of clients that are logo design clients. That I just worked on one last night that had to do with somebody. Their company was called Because Sugar, and they're a chef. They're a bake chef, a baker, I guess you'd call that. And so I designed a logo for them, and I do this kind of stuff day in and day out. That's my bread and butter. That's what I do to support my radio show habit. And so if you need a logo design, a book cover design, you're an author. If you're a children's author and you need children's illustrations, I do a hell of a lot of that for books. Right now I'm in the midst of graphic novels for a science fiction author who wanted to convert all of his award-winning science fiction novel into 3 graphic novels. So I'm in the middle of that. Big project, huge project. And so this is the kind of stuff I do. If you need work done of that nature, I'm your boyo. Come on over. Go over to streamingtalkradio.com. click on my picture. You'll find out how to find all my sites, look at my work, see the kind of stuff I do, or just go to scottallenroberts.com and come on over. And also, I want to make one last mention. Looking for a good hat, a good lid for yourself, for your significant other, no better place than penmanhats.com. Penman, Penman. Christmas is coming. I'm not sure how quickly John can do a hat. I know he's got a waiting list, but he's also got different levels of hats that you can get. Some that are prefabricated that he puts all the bashing in to shape it for you. Others he does entirely from raw materials and creates them for you. You see some of his hats hanging here. This was my most recent hat from Penman Hats. And they're phenomenal hats. And the quality is unbelievable. This is a beaver quality here. And you can see he does a fantastic job at what he does. So nothing goes on my head unless it's got a Penman liner on the inside. All right, folks, that's it for my advertising, myself and my good friend. Let's jump right back into this material. We ended up, while talking about this stuff in the first segment, talking about how the Christian community started compiling its sayings of Jesus. And it's very interesting to note that the four Gospels were quoted nowhere in that first 150 years after the time of Jesus. You didn't see any mention of them anywhere in any Christian writings, or in any other book of the New Testament or any work of art before the latter part of the 2nd century. So another 100 years on top of that no. That's right, about 150 years after the life of Jesus. And so, and some of that stuff was before, not even until the latter part of the 2nd century, and not even in the Christian catacombs in Rome. You didn't see any of the mention of Gospels or verses from the Gospels. And so the earliest extant fragment of a Gospel has been dated only to the mid to late 2nd century. And so we're talking, the 200s. Yeah, 2nd century. So I always get thrown off because the 20th century was the 1900s. The 21st century is the 2000s. So the 1st century was below 100, 0 to 99. And then 2nd century is the 100s. So there you go. So it was in the late 100s, the late 2nd century, that you first started to see any fragment of a gospel that was dated to that time. And the first definitive mention of the Gospels was made by Bishop Irenaeus in his book, Against the Heretics. And he released that, and book releases were different back then. He wrote that book approximately 185 AD. So, you're talking late 2nd century. And this indicates that the Gospels may have been created much later than is assumed. And why can we assume that? Because nobody knew about him. Nobody wrote about him. Nobody talked about him in that first 150 to 170 years after the time of Jesus. And so they could have been created much later than has been assumed, and could have been much more or less simultaneous. They all started sprouting up. Now, the 2nd century was a pivotal time in the church in early Christianity because the Gnostic Marcion had just assembled his own. Let me back that up because I fumbled on the name. It's because the Gnostic Marcion had just assembled his own group of scriptures. The Marcion came to Rome. He converted to Christianity while in Rome. And in 138 AD, we're talking 100 to 110 years after the life of Jesus, and he soon became a Gnostic. He was expelled from the church. We no longer want you here, because remember, the church was doing away with Gnosticism, destroying the Gnostic works, the Gnostic writings, the Gnostic Gospels. And in 144, Marcion found himself booted from the Orthodox Church. And within 10 years, he established his own Gnostic church, which attracted large numbers of people and spread over much of the Roman Empire of the day. And among other things, Marcion rejected Jewish scriptures, that's the Old Testament, and believed that Christ had completely freed humankind from Jewish law. In response, Rome, the church in Rome, moved in the opposite direction and claimed Jewish scripture as Christianity's own heritage. After all, didn't Jesus say, "I'm not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law"? Maybe a trick on words there. Did he say that? Or was that added later? These are the questions. These are the questions, folks. These are the questions. So Marcion established a canon of scripture that consisted of 10 epistles. The epistles were the letters, the guys like Paul. When you look at the Bible, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, those different books, they were letters to certain churches in Corinth, and things like that. So they're called epistles. And an early form of what would become the Gospel of Luke was part of his canon, and later greatly expanded by the church. And Marcion adopted Paul's epistles because they supported his Gnostic views of what Christianity was supposed to be. And this appropriation of Paul is what the author Earl Doherty believes spurred the church to establish its own canon of scriptures, which included the creation of the expanded Book of Luke, Gospel of Luke, and the composition of the Book of Acts, which was also by Luke, so that Paul would be rehabilitated and rescued from the Gnostics, and a wider apostolic base of authority would be established. Do you think Jesus and God, if Jesus is God, do you think that this is what he was teaching, to have all this infighting in the church about what was really what he said, which one of his disciples actually wrote anything about him, if any of them, if it weren't just attributed to his disciples? All these fights over what to believe is what we were left with after the time of Jesus. Is this what Jesus promoted? WWJD, what would Jesus do? WWJP, what would Jesus promote? So even after the 2nd century, the Gospels circulated in a number of versions that often differed significantly from each other. They didn't always have this great harmony going on. And the New Testament scholar Graham Stanton notes that in the 3rd century, Origen lamented the state of the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, when he said, quote, Origen said in the 3rd century, "It's an obvious fact today that there is much diversity among the manuscripts, due either to the carelessness of the scribes or to the perverse audacity of some people in correcting the text. Or again to the fact that there are those who add or delete as they please, setting themselves up as correctors." End quote. So Stanton picked chapters 10 and 11 of Mark at random and studied all the early manuscripts that still exist of those chapters, and he found in 2 chapters of the Gospel of Mark, he found 48 differences among the existing copies of the book of Mark. We're not talking different books. We're talking different copies of Mark. He found 48 differences between the copies that were in existence and when he was studying this. And so the New Testament scholar Burton Mack states that the majority of scholars agree that the only books in the New Testament written by those whose names are attached to them are the book of Revelation, written by John, and 7 of the letters of Paul. Then he says that most of the writings in the New Testament were either written anonymously and later assigned to a person of the past, or written later as a pseudonym for some person thought to have been important. And so he goes on to say that over the course of the 2nd and the 3rd centuries, the crucial time period for the appearance of either Gospels and epistles, and also, as noted earlier, the first biographical material about Jesus, the church authorities were able to create the impression of a singular, monolinear history of the Christian church? Why do you think they wanted to do away with all the other gospels that existed? Because it didn't fall in alignment with what the Orthodox Church hierarchy was attempting to establish. Therefore, the view that modern readers have of the New Testament as a charter document for Christianity is understandable. So according to Mark, since this is precisely what the church intended to do, was create this impression. So, I got a lot of material here. I'm just checking my clock to make sure how much time I have to start digging into more stuff. But I want you to think about these things that we're talking about. If you're into it that deeply, if you keep a journal about it, write about it, or just cogitate on it. What do you think about this material that's presented over the authorship, the collections of writings, things like, what do you think about the possibility that most of what you find in the New Testament is attributed to someone who didn't actually write it and has been changed over the years? Let me ask you a very democratic impeachment hearing question. How does that make you feel? How do you feel about this? Do you agree or disagree with the findings of the scholars? And I want you to think back to when we were talking about your spirituality. If the myth and stories surrounding these things were removed, think about what you thought about that. If we took away all the myth, and then you're left with your raw spirituality, what would remain of it? What would remain of your values, your ethics, your beliefs, and why would you adopt them? If you knew that the writings of Jesus weren't really the writings of Jesus, sayings, I mean, that most of what you see attributed to certain personages in the New Testament, they didn't really write those. They were written by church fathers attempting to establish a continuity in early church structure and politic. How does that make you feel about what you put your faith into? If anything, I hope all it does is spur you to think about it. I'm not asking you to change your faith. Maybe there's something missing in this whole equation. Maybe this is where my friend said this morning, well, if you just had enough faith, it would all fall into place. Well, I had that faith at one point, and I started questioning things to find substance for my faith, and that's when I drifted away from it. So, but ask yourself, I'm not encouraging you to do anything other than to think for yourself on all of these things. How would your values and ethics change if Jesus and the events and the characters in the New Testament are not really historical, but they're more symbolic, maybe even metaphoric, allegorical at times? Would that impact the way you identify the essentials of your spirituality? Why? Why or why not? Would that affect you? Take a sip of coffee on that one. Caffeine-induced talking here. So, ask yourself to what extent your spirituality, whatever it might be, Christianity, pagan, something else, ask yourself to what extent your spirituality is dependent on Jesus and the New Testament being absolutely historically true. What would happen if the truth of that rug of truth was pulled out from under your feet? Would your faith remain the same? What would happen to your spirituality if their historicity were suddenly disproved? Beyond any doubt. Identify the essentials of your spirituality and what you believe would remain. Are these any essentials? Are there any essentials you think you'd lose? Pardon me, I'm having like hiccups, and I'm trying to quell them, not in the source point, but in the stoppage point. so I can talk straight. What would be left after you stripped some things away? All right. And so discuss with yourself or with others this whole idea of the details of your faith's mythos, the things that construct your faith and your spirituality. Look into that. If your faith values proselytizing or witnessing to others, we used to call it calling. We'd go witness to people. Where would you be 5 minutes after you die? Can I give you this gospel tract to read? If your faith depends on that, ask yourself, am I spreading the truth? Or am I spreading what I have accepted by faith as the truth with no real evidence of that? So, history contains one type of truth because it claims to recount events and facts accurately. This is temporal truth. Myth contains another kind of truth that speaks outside of history and outside of the establishment of historical fact. You can bet your life that the first time I went to Egypt, and I was with my friend John Ward, and we together wrote the book The Exodus Reality, presenting our two different views of Moses and the Exodus. Not a biblical work, but it was a scholarly work about a biblical topic. And you can bet your life I was looking to see what I could find that matched my understanding of what the Scripture told me. And I had to keep asking that question as I started picking up facts and learning things. Does this align with what's written? Is what was written align with history? With what we know about history? Does the absence of history on something indicate that there is an absence of story altogether? Not necessarily. So you got to ask yourself if what we have in hand is enough to carry your faith. And if there is nothing to substantiate your faith, why in hell would you believe it? Just because somebody wrote down in a book that you should believe it that way? I have a tough time living my life that way. I don't know about you. Can you identify some of the eternal mythic truths of Christianity for yourself? Identify at least 5. If you claim Christianity, can you identify 5 mythic truths about Christianity? Do the same for paganism. If you're a pagan, what are the mythic truths about what you believe, about what your spirituality is based upon? Now, I could say to somebody, if I were to go black and white with this and say, you shouldn't believe in Jesus because there's no proof that he actually is divine. Well, couldn't we say about paganism? Well, why would you believe in any of the pagan god men out there or the mysteries when there's no way to prove that they really exist? The question goes across the board. Don't just replace something with something else. Surrogacy doesn't work if there is no foundation for it. So find the similarities. Find out why you believe what you believe. And I think that's why you're going to get to the truth that you need to incorporate into your spirituality. Do I incorporate something I simply refer to as the truth because I've been told it's the truth? Or do I accept that it's the truth because despite the fact that I have no evidence to back it up? There's a good question to ask yourself. So let's move on to finding the harmony in the differences now. If there's one overriding theme amongst scholars, and a lot of the scholars I've mentioned as we've been talking about this, it's that what had been meant to be taken symbolically became historical for the Orthodox Church. And this development cut Christianity off completely from its pagan beginnings and estranged it from the deeper universal meanings or metaphors to which myth as symbol points. It set up this adversarial mindset between Christianity, paganism, sects within Christianity that believed one way or the other, and other religions. And it led to cruelties. It led to destruction. It led to needless human suffering on all sides, all throughout the centuries. Is this what any of these faiths were meant to do? Many of the scholars surveyed believe that Christianity needs to accept the fact that it has pagan origins, and that the gradual transformation of symbolic myth into historical fact is what took place. One wonders how long it will be before the minds that go so far toward the truth will not go the few additional steps to the goal of the full truth of something. We say we're believing in truth, yet we won't take the step to go that further bit and say, well, there's more than what we think is there. And far more than were the first and second centuries. We have a lot more material to find. The entire ancient period was transfused with the spirit of poetic and mythic representation of wisdom, and that the entire gospel content was a formulation of this nature and of the immemorable antiquity that no longer exists. And farther, the tragedy is that so few can go beyond the symbol to the deeper plummeting. Erroneous traditions presses so heavily in on us that we're afraid to let go of the symbol, and the thing that was been comfortable believed for so long as fact itself, and reach for the wondrous grace of the miracle of the meaning beyond it. Are you stuck on the historical and forgotten the mythological? If Christianity were able to move beyond this fear, and believe you me, it's a fear. When I started questioning these things, and I said, you know what, I think this, I choose not to believe that anymore. Even sometimes now, I get that twinge of, I'm going to have to answer for this before God, you know. Even though I don't know. I have no knowledge of what is true, really, other than the historical facts. And so if Christianity were to be able to move beyond that type of fear, then what? The energy being spent on ferreting out the historical Jesus could be freed for other activities. No amount of archaeology can ever prove a myth to be true. And such a change could also open the doors to interfaith dialogue, an understanding that now is currently closed. You only see a glimmer of light in that area. And it includes this greater appreciation of the blending of spiritualities, such as Christopaganism. By allowing Jesus to be deeply true in the mythical sense rather than literally as God, the vast theological offense currently given to the majority of other faiths is absolutely and entirely removed. But what if we're wrong about that? What if Jesus is God? Something that wasn't taught in the first 3 centuries after his death within Christianity. The vast theological offense currently given to the majority of other faiths is removed. And this opens up the way to interfaith understanding that otherwise can never exist. How can you exist on an interfaith basis with someone you believe they're going to hell because of their teachings? Because Jesus is the one and only true God with no proof to back that up. So we cut off the other people. Taking a step like that is going to increase the emphasis on personal responsibility with your faith, with what you believe, as it would move people away from what's called this current idolatrous cult of personal Jesus, and into a space where everyone is expected to assume complete responsibility for his or her own faith struggle. And the problem with a literal, historical Jesus is that most people see him as a type of celestial Superman who will transform each of us by some remote magic and save us from the evolutionary task of transfiguring ourselves. We got to end it there, folks. Thanks for being here. I'm going to take a weekend break, and we'll be back on Monday evening. Also, watch for 9 a.m. Central Time on Sunday morning when we're going to do It's Sunday. Maybe do some readings and some other things like that. So, thanks for being here. Love y'all. Talk to you soon.